most historians get it completely wrong. When they talk about gangster weapons from the Prohibition era, they focus on the obvious stuff, the Tommy guns, the snub-nosed revolvers, the sawed-off shotguns that Hollywood made famous. But here's the truth that never made it into the history books. The deadliest weapons gangsters actually carried were the ones designed to be forgotten. Not forgotten by accident, forgotten by intention, by design. Today, I'm showing you the weapons that were engineered to vanish from memory. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded so completely that the people who carried them burned every record, broke every mold, and buried the blueprints where nobody could find them. These weren't showpiece weapons. These were the tools of men who understood that if a weapon could be traced, the weapon could betray you. The reason these weapons vanished from history isn't mysterious at all. It's ruthlessly practical. When the National Firearms Act passed in 1934, organized crime didn't panic about the guns they owned. They panicked about the evidence. Every weapon that could be traced back to a manufacturer, every serial number that linked a gun to a crime scene, every piece of hardware that connected a trigger to a name became a liability. So the smart operators, the ones who lived long enough to retire in Florida, they destroyed what they could and forgot about the rest. But there's something far stranger hiding in this story. The weapons that survived, the ones we can actually document today, they tell a different narrative than anyone wants to admit. They reveal that the real innovation in Prohibition-era crime wasn't about firepower. It was about invisibility. It was about building weapons that looked like something else entirely. Let me walk you through something that law enforcement completely missed for years. The most sophisticated concealment method of the 1920s wasn't a shoulder holster or an ankle strap. It was embedded in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of how a man dressed. A well-dressed gangster in Chicago or New York didn't just care about his appearance because of vanity. His clothing was functional hardware. A suit jacket wasn't decoration. It was a weapon system. The inside pocket could be cut deeper than normal to accommodate a pistol. The seams could be reinforced with steel thread to prevent a knife from being pulled free if grabbed. The buttons could be made from materials that looked like pearl, but rang like metal when struck against a skull. Tailors in Little Italy and the Lower East Side weren't just making clothes. They were manufacturing concealment systems. A legitimate tailor might make 50 suits a week for regular businessmen. But in the back room, away from street-level windows, those same tailors made perhaps 2 or 3 specialized pieces. These weren't suits for banking executives. These were custom killing tools disguised as haberdashery. One of the most remarkable examples that resurfaced decades later in a private collection was a dinner jacket created around 1927. On the surface, it appeared to be expensive formal wear, silk lining, perfectly cut, the kind of jacket a successful bootlegger might wear to an upscale restaurant. But the jacket had modifications that would only be visible under close inspection. The lapel on one side was stiffened with a razor-thin blade of spring steel that curved along the inside seam. If a man grabbed you by the collar in a struggle, you could strike upward with precision. The sleeve had 3 lead weights sewn into the cuff, perfectly balanced so they hung invisibly. A backhand punch thrown while wearing that sleeve could break ribs. The jacket was never confiscated. The tailor never testified about it. It passed through 3 estates before a collector realized what he had. By then, the man who wore it had been dead for 40 years. But this reveals something historians have overlooked entirely. The reason these weapons disappeared from history isn't because they were destroyed. It's because the people who created them were fundamentally anonymous. A master gunsmith might achieve legendary status among criminal circles. His reputation could be gold, but that reputation was kept entirely within closed networks. A bootlegger from Detroit might travel to a cellar workshop in Milwaukee to commission a special piece, pay in cash, receive it wrapped in brown paper, and never ask for the craftsman's name. This was radical secrecy, but it was also practical survival. If you don't know the gunsmith's name, you can't give it up under interrogation. If you've never seen his face clearly, you can't describe him to police. If the weapon has no serial number and no maker's mark, there's no chain of evidence leading back to anyone. The closest we get to understanding this underground manufacturing network comes from trial records and FBI files that only became partially declassified in the 1970s. Federal agents pieced together fragments, references in wiretaps to the guy in the basement on Clark Street, mentions in testimony about a one-handed craftsman in St. Paul, stories about a woman in Kansas City who made knives that wouldn't show up on the portable metal detectors the police were starting to use. These were real people, real networks, real production. And they operated with a sophistication that modern criminal enterprises haven't matched. One network that emerged in Philadelphia was particularly interesting because partial documentation survived. Law enforcement finally cracked the operation in 1931, not because they found weapons, but because they found a ledger, a single leather notebook where one of the craftsmen had recorded measurements and materials. The notebook was in code, simple, really just numbers representing letters, but once decrypted, it listed orders. 37 different pieces over 4 years. The notebook didn't provide names of customers, only heights, hand sizes, and physical descriptions. Tall left-handed man, Chicago connection. Scarred left cheek, needs compact piece, strong single action. From that single notebook, federal agents learned that a coordinated weapons manufacturing operation had been running for years, producing pieces specifically designed for individual operators, custom hardware built for specific hands and specific purposes. The weapons themselves were remarkable, not because they were more powerful than factory production, but because they were optimized for concealment and speed. A pistol might be shortened to 7 inches total length, but engineered with such precision that it still maintained accuracy at 15 feet. Trigger mechanisms were modified to require less pressure, designed for men with arthritis or damaged hands. Grips were custom fitted, some with ridges carved in specific patterns that only worked if you held exactly right. But here's the counterintuitive reality that changes everything. These custom pieces were rarely used. The moment you fired a custom weapon, the moment that unique slug left the barrel and lodged in a body, you'd created physical evidence. A ballistics expert could eventually trace that bullet back to your specific gun, your specific barrel, your specific history. The truly sophisticated operators understood this. They carried custom weapons as insurance, yes, but they used them sparingly, maybe once in an entire lifetime. The weapons that actually killed people during Prohibition were far more mundane. Factory-produced pistols identical to thousands of others. Weapons with no history, no provenance, no connection to the user. A man would acquire a gun for a specific job, use it once, and it would be gone the same night, dropped in a river, melted down, or passed to someone else in the organization who would use it next. This is why the forgotten weapons of the Prohibition era are fundamentally different from what most histories describe. The weapons that truly shaped organized crime in America weren't forgotten because they were innovative or rare. They were forgotten because they were designed to be disposable. They were built to be used and disappeared, to leave no trace, to create no evidence. The romantic notion of a gangster carrying the same gun throughout his career, building a legendary weapon with a personal history and a name, that's Hollywood fantasy. Real operators understood operational security in ways that seem almost modern. They understood that every object has a history, and history is evidence. One Philadelphia detective who spent 20 years investigating organized crime wrote in his unpublished memoirs, found after his death in 2003, that he came to realize the smartest criminals were the ones he never caught. And the reason he never caught them was that they understood a simple principle. The weapon is the weakest link in the chain. Get rid of the weapon, and you eliminate the most damning physical evidence. But that requires weapons that can be obtained anonymously and disposed of completely. This realization leads to a completely different understanding of Prohibition-era criminal enterprises. They weren't building an arsenal. They were building a supply chain, a pipeline for obtaining weapons without signatures, without names, without connections. Every week, every month, new guns entered the system, untraceable, identical, replaceable. When a gun became dangerous because it was used, or because it was seized in a minor raid, or because the serial number showed up in a police database somewhere, it was instantly replaced. The real crime wasn't in the engineering. The real crime was in the logistics. That principle transformed how we need to understand the hidden weapons of the Prohibition underworld. When you follow the supply chain backwards, you discover something historians have almost completely overlooked. The weapons weren't the point. The organization was. And the organization required an entire ecosystem of suppliers, fixers, and anonymous intermediaries who made sure a gun could travel from factory to firing squad without leaving a single traceable fingerprint. Consider the blank receiver strategy. In the 1920s, 1930s, you could legally purchase unfinished gun receivers, the main body of a pistol or rifle, because they technically weren't firearms yet. A receiver without the firing mechanism, the barrel, the trigger assembly, was just a chunk of metal. It had no legal classification. It crossed no borders that triggered inspections. It moved through rail cars and shipping channels with zero documentation. But once that blank receiver landed in a basement workshop or a garage or a tailor's back room, skilled gunsmiths could finish the work in a single evening. Bore the barrel, install the breech block, assemble the trigger mechanism. What emerged was a fully functional handgun with zero factory markings, zero serial number, zero connection to any licensed manufacturer. This wasn't some backyard tinkerer fumbling around. These were people with real training. Many had worked in legitimate gunsmith shops. Some had been gunsmiths for legitimate companies and then went independent. They understood metallurgy. They understood tolerances. They understood that a gun that malfunctioned didn't just fail to fire. It could explode in your hand, taking your fingers with it. A weapon that couldn't be trusted was worthless. So these gunsmiths, working in the shadows, built guns that were actually superior to many factory models. The finished product was called a ghost gun in the language of the street, though that term wasn't widely used until decades later. But the concept was ancient, a weapon with no origin story, no way to trace it backwards. If that gun was used in a shooting, if it was seized at a crime scene, if it was entered into evidence, it led nowhere. No serial number meant no factory record. No factory record meant no distributor. No distributor meant no dealer. No dealer meant no suspect. And that was just the supply chain for common pistols. The truly specialized weapons required different routes entirely. Take the 22 caliber specialty rounds that showed up in organized crime homicides throughout the 1930s. A 22 long rifle cartridge is small enough to fit in your palm. The recoil is minimal. The sound signature is quiet, especially with a suppressor attached, because the round moves at subsonic velocity. You can fire it through a pillow and someone in the next room barely registers the noise. Yet at close range, within 5 to 10 feet, a 22 round to the head or the spine is absolutely lethal. Ammunition manufacturers produced millions of .22 rounds for legitimate purposes: hunting, target shooting, sport competitions. But the criminal networks had perfected a different selection method. They identified specific ammunition lots, batches produced during particular weeks in particular years, that had slightly different metallurgical properties. Some ammunition runs produced rounds with harder brass casings, some had softer lead cores, some were loaded to specific velocity ranges. By selecting ammunition from runs that were distributed through specific channels, certain hardware stores in certain neighborhoods, the criminal organizations could ensure that if a bullet was recovered from a crime scene, it would be virtually impossible to trace. The ammunition lot number alone might point to a factory in Connecticut or New Jersey, but from there, the trail went cold. Thousands of retailers across the country carried that ammunition. Any one of them could have sold it to anyone. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. This was deliberate tradecraft, developed through trial and error, refined through years of watching their own operations get disrupted when weapons could be connected to people. One federal agent who spent 30 years investigating organized crime, never published his memoirs, never gave interviews, maintained his anonymity until death, left behind a private archive that surfaced in the 1990s. In his notes, he documented something that rattled him deeply. The organizations he was fighting didn't operate like criminal enterprises. They operated like legitimate supply chain businesses. They had procurement officers. They had quality control inspections. They had logistics coordinators. They had relationships with manufacturers and distributors that were so deeply embedded in legitimate commerce that separating legal sales from illegal diversions became almost impossible. A factory owner in Ohio would receive an order for 10,000 pistols from a legitimate distributor. He would produce those 10,000 pistols. The distributor would sell 8,000 to retail chains, gun shops, and pawnbrokers across the country. The remaining 2,000 would move through different channels, different trucks, different invoices, different paperwork into the criminal supply system. From the factory owner's perspective, he had done nothing wrong. He had sold 10,000 pistols to a registered buyer. The crime existed in the details, in the routing, in the coordination that happened between dozens of separate transactions that individually were completely legal. If you wanted to understand the truly hidden weapons of Prohibition, not the famous Tommy guns or the bootleggers' shotguns, but the tools that actually shaped the violence of the era, you had to start not with the weapons themselves, but with the supply lines that fed them. The Sears catalog, for instance. Most people today don't realize that Sears, Roebuck and Company was one of the largest distributors of firearms in America during the 1920s and 1930s. You could page through the catalogue, circle an item, mail in an order with a check, and a few weeks later, a crate arrived at your local train station. No background check, no license for questions, asked about who was actually going to use the weapon. Organised crime networks would coordinate mail orders. A dozen members would each order one or two guns from different Sears catalogues in different cities. The weapons would arrive at different addresses. Then they would converge in a central location, a safe house, a warehouse, a basement, where they would be stored, maintained, and distributed as needed. The genius of this system was its invisibility in plain sight. There was nothing illegal about Sears selling firearms. There was nothing illegal about an individual ordering a gun by mail. But the coordination, the timing, the locations, the routing of the weapons transformed legal commerce into a criminal supply operation. And once those weapons entered the street-level operations, they moved through a different kind of supply chain entirely. Guns weren't kept long. A weapon used in one job would be passed to another operative for a different job. That gun might be used 3 times in 3 months, each time by a different person in a different neighborhood. If the gun was seized, it led to whoever was caught with it at that moment, not to the person who had used it previously, not to the supply chain that had delivered it. This is why Detective Holloway, the federal agent I mentioned, came to understand that the most dangerous criminals were the ones who understood that a weapon should be treated like a single-use tool, not a possession, not an asset to be maintained and valued, a tool that was obtained, used once or twice, and then discarded or redistributed. The weapons that were caught were never the important ones. They were the ones that had already served their purpose, the ones that criminals were willing to discard. Because by then, a dozen new weapons had already entered the system through a dozen different channels, and the supply kept flowing, unstoppable, invisible, part of the machine itself. This is where the real history lives, not in courtroom records or official histories, but in the gaps between what was documented and what was actually happening on the streets. Because while police were cataloguing the weapons they found, an entirely different arsenal was being engineered in basements and backroom workshops. Weapons so effective, so purposefully designed for concealment, that they never made it into evidence logs at all. Number 12 was called the friction knife, and it represents something crucial about the evolution of forbidden weapons during the Prohibition era. Unlike the collar-stay stiletto, which relied on deception through disguise, the friction knife was built on a principle of perfect simplicity. A blade, roughly 3 inches long with no handle. Instead, the spine of the blade was wrapped tightly with heavy cord, creating what looked like nothing more than a stick of kindling if you found it in someone's pocket. But in a man's clenched fist, the cord distributed the force across the palm, allowing a user to generate tremendous pressure without the leverage of a traditional handle. The blade could be driven upward between ribs with minimal physical effort. It was a weapon designed specifically for the close quarters violence that happened in speakeasies, in cars, in back alleyways where men stood facing each other across tables or across sidewalks. The friction knife required intimacy. It required that moment of perfect closeness where you could feel your opponent's breath. And it was devastatingly effective precisely because it demanded that closeness. Police departments had no official classification for it. They couldn't catalogue it because it had no mechanism, no moving parts, no identifying marks. A man could carry 5 of them, and if he was caught with even one, he could claim it was simply cord-wrapped scrap metal, plausible deniability built into the design itself. The craftsmen who built these weapons understood something that modern self-defense instructors often miss. The most lethal weapons are not the ones with the most complex engineering. They're the ones that distribute responsibility across multiple layers. The responsibility of the responsibility of proximity, the responsibility of intention. A gun is undeniably a weapon. Everyone knows it. But a piece of cord-wrapped metal? That could be almost anything. That ambiguity was protection. Number 11 is something that almost no historian mentions because it exists in a space between criminal weapon and legitimate tool. It was called a weighting hammer. Essentially, it was a carpenter's hammer that had been modified. The head was filled with mercury. A standard hammer weighs 3 or 4 pounds. A weighting hammer could weigh 8, 9, even 10 pounds, depending on how much mercury had been sealed inside the head. The effect was catastrophic. A single strike could fracture a skull with a force that seemed disproportionate to the apparent weight of the tool. And because it looked, at first glance, like a standard carpenter's hammer, a man could carry one openly. He could be a contractor doing repair work. He could be a builder. moving between job sites. No one questioned a man with a hammer. But when that hammer was brought down in the darkness of a basement or the back seat of a car, it became something entirely different. The mercury shifted inside the head on impact, creating a shock wave through the target that a normal hammer could never achieve. Men who used these weapons understood physics in a practical, visceral way. They understood leverage and mass and force, not from textbooks, from experience, from doing. The police reports from this era are fascinating because they're filled with gaps. Detectives describing injuries that don't match any known weapon. Coroners struggling to categorize the wounds. How do you catalog damage inflicted by something that doesn't exist in your classification system? How do you warn the public about a weapon they can't even identify? You don't. You file the report, you mark it unsolved, and you move on to the next case. And the next. Number 10 was possibly the most ingenious in terms of pure design philosophy. It was called a belt gun. Essentially, it was a single-shot smoothbore pistol that was actually incorporated into the construction of a leather belt itself. The barrel was hidden within the thickness of the belt. The trigger mechanism was a modified clasp. A man could wear this belt openly. He could stand at a bar, his jacket open, and no one would see anything except an ordinary accessory. But if needed, he could pull the belt partially from his waist, position it against someone's abdomen beneath a table or in the dark and fire. One shot, one opportunity. After that, the belt was useless as a weapon. But the beauty was that a man could make it through an entire night, walk through a dozen different locations, submit to multiple frisks and searches, and no one would ever detect it because it was literally the clothes he was wearing. The inventor of the belt gun was never caught. No one was ever arrested specifically for manufacturing them. What we know about the design comes from a single recovered example that was discovered in a house during a property seizure in Kansas City in 1931. That belt is currently in a private collection. Museums don't have it. The general public has never seen detailed photographs of its internal mechanism. But the principle is documented. And once you understand the principle, you understand that this same approach could be applied to dozens of other everyday objects. A shoe with a hidden chamber containing a blade, a hat with reinforced panels that could be hardened into a striking weapon, a pencil case that concealed something far more lethal than pencils. This is where the innovation became truly dangerous. Not just in the execution of specific weapons, but in the mindset that said any object, any tool, any piece of clothing could be weaponized. And once that mindset was established, there was no limiting principle, no way to prevent it. Because you cannot ban all objects. You cannot make it illegal to carry a belt or wear a shoe or use a pencil. The weapons existed in the space between the object and the intention. And intention is invisible. Number 9 was something different entirely. It was called a tripwire knife. During the Prohibition era, there were specific locations where violence was almost guaranteed. Speakeasies that were under siege. Homes of gang leaders that were targeted for assassination attempts. Protection became a critical concern, and some operators began setting up defensive systems that were surprisingly sophisticated for the era. A tripwire knife was essentially a thin blade, 6 to 8 inches long, mounted on a spring-loaded mechanism. It would be concealed above a doorway or along a corridor where an intruder would brush against it. The spring tension would be just sufficient to drive the blade forward at chest height when the wire was disturbed. It was an automated weapon. No aiming required, no human decision-making involved, just the simple mechanics of physics and surprise. These traps were never mass-produced because they were situation-specific. Each one was custom-built for a particular location, and they were incredibly effective. Medical records from Chicago hospitals during the 1920s and 1930s show numerous cases of deep chest wounds that have no clear explanation in the official police reports. Injuries that occurred indoors, in private locations, injuries that the victims themselves were often unwilling to fully explain, because explaining how you got stabbed would require admitting where you were and why. The weapons that shaped Prohibition-era violence were often the ones that left the fewest traces, the ones that required no follow-up, no investigation, no public accounting. And the craftsmen who built them understood this. They understood that the most successful weapon was not the one that killed most efficiently, but the one that generated the least evidence, the least explanation, the least official record of what had actually occurred. The weapons of Prohibition did not disappear because they were catalogued and eliminated. They disappeared because they were forgotten, because the men who built them are gone, because the speakeasies are closed and the bootleggers are dead, and the enforcers have turned to dust. because the world moved on to other conflicts, other weapons, other histories. But the knowledge persists. The designs exist somewhere in the archives of private collectors and forgotten evidence rooms. And the principle remains true. Any object can become a weapon if someone intelligent and determined decides it should be. That principle was dangerous in 1920. It is dangerous now. The difference is that in the Prohibition era, the innovation came from necessity. A bootlegger in Pittsburgh did not have access to military-grade weaponry, so he improvised. A speakeasy owner in Kansas City could not hire trained soldiers, so he armed his friends with whatever they could manufacture. The constraint forced creativity. The desperation bred ingenuity. And the result was a generation of weapons that was so effective, perfectly adapted to their specific purpose, that they left almost no trace in the historical record. The men who could have told us what these weapons were, how they worked, why they were designed that way, they died without writing it down. They took the specifications to their graves. Their workshops were demolished. Their apprentices moved on to legitimate professions. And within a generation, the knowledge was gone, replaced by Hollywood myth and sensationalized newspaper accounts that missed the technical genius entirely. But here is what matters. The gap between what we know and what actually happened is enormous. Museums do not have collections dedicated to Prohibition-era concealed weapons. Universities do not offer courses in bootlegger engineering. Historians have largely ignored this entire category of innovation because it sits in a moral grey area. These were not weapons of war. They were not ceremonial or collected by enthusiasts. They were tools made by practical people solving practical problems in illegal ways. And that combination, practicality plus illegality plus anonymity, means that the real history remains almost entirely unknown. What you have watched today is a partial reconstruction. These weapons existed. The evidence for them is scattered across police reports, trial transcripts, parole records, and the oral histories of aging informants. Some items survive in private collections, hidden from public view, because their owners understand their value. Others have been destroyed intentionally or lost to time. And still others were never recorded in the first place because they were manufactured in such small quantities for such specific purposes that they never entered the formal inventory of history. The deeper question is why we have allowed this history to be forgotten. Why does the popular imagination conjure images of Tommy guns and big shootouts when the real story was far more sophisticated? The answer is that sensationalism sells better than subtlety. Drama outsells engineering. And a story about ordinary men solving extraordinary problems in quiet, intelligent ways does not generate the same box office revenue as tales of gangster empires and gang warfare. But that does not mean the real history is unimportant. In fact, it is more important precisely because it has been ignored. The weapons you have learned about today represent the intelligence of people working at the margins of society. They demonstrate what humans are capable of creating when conventional channels are closed to them. And they show us something about American innovation that the mainstream narrative completely overlooks, that some of the most ingenious problem solving in our history happened in places and among people that official institutions preferred not to acknowledge. If you want to understand this period deeply, if you want to know not just what these weapons were, but how they were made, who made them, and why they succeeded where conventional weapons failed, I have included a comprehensive resource guide in the description and in the pinned comment that walks through the technical specifications, the historical context, and the surviving documentation for each of these weapons. It goes far deeper than we can here, with photographs of actual surviving examples and detailed breakdowns of their engineering principles. The Prohibition era ended in 1933. By 1934, the National Firearms Act was passed. By 1935, organized crime had adapted to the new legal framework. The weapons we have discussed were already becoming obsolete. The men who made them were already moving into legitimate trades or facing long prison sentences. The era of innovation driven by necessity was ending, replaced by an era in which organized crime operated within legal structures, always successfully, but within the framework nonetheless. What emerged after Prohibition was a different kind of criminal ingenuity. The speakeasy gave way to the casino. The bootlegger gave way to the loan shark. The enforcer gave way to the accountant. The weapons became less important because the economy of illegal enterprise became more sophisticated. You did not need a perfectly engineered concealed blade when you had lawyers and politicians on your payroll. You did not need to improvise when you could simply purchase what you needed through established channels that now existed in the post-prohibition underworld. But the weapons themselves, the specific objects we have discussed, they represent a moment in American history when ingenuity and necessity created something that has never been fully documented or understood. These were not weapons of empire. They were not weapons of ideology. They were weapons of survival, created by men who understood that they were locked out of legitimate power and who responded with intelligence and resourcefulness. The weapons are gone, the makers are gone, the world they created them for is gone. But the principle remains. And the knowledge, fragmented as it is, scattered across archives and private collections and the memories of aging informants, the knowledge persists. It exists. It is waiting for someone curious enough and patient enough to assemble it. It is waiting for historians to recognize that the margins of society sometimes produce innovations that the centers never could. That is the final truth about these weapons. They were not sophisticated because they were designed by engineers with advanced degrees working in well-funded laboratories. They were sophisticated because they were designed by people who understood constraint as a creative force. They took the materials available to them, ordinary metal, ordinary tools, ordinary leather, ordinary cloth, and transformed those materials into objects that served extraordinary purposes. And they did this without documentation, without formal training, without institutional support. If you have found this exploration valuable, if you have discovered something in this account that changes how you understand American history or industrial innovation or the resourcefulness of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, I need you to do something specific. Check the description right now and find the advanced research archive that breaks down the technical specifications for each weapon we've covered today, along with the surviving photographs and the historical